If you've struggled to get realistic sounding MIDI strings, this video is going to help you out. In this video, I'm going to show you 7 tips that can help you go from this to this. Getting orchestral sample libraries to sound realistic is definitely something that we all struggle with in the beginning. So if you're getting overwhelmed and maybe a bit frustrated because you cannot achieve this realistic sound, I just want to let you know you're not alone. Even though I got my Bachelor of Music in Instrumental Composition, I still struggled with this stuff for quite a while. I studied under some amazing professors and learned how to write for the full orchestra at a fairly high level, but I quickly learned that those skills don't directly translate to working with sample libraries and MIDI instruments. Working with sample libraries is a completely different skill set, and in this video, I'm going to show you the fundamental steps to getting your MIDI strings to sound realistic. That being said, let's get into it. Alright, here we are inside of Logic, and this is the session that I prepared for the video, and as you can see, I already have all these different MIDI regions laid out. So the way that this is going to work is we're going to start with this first example here, and with each of these 7 tips we're just going to change one thing at a time, and I tried to keep this as simple as possible. I don't want to go super in depth and overwhelm you. Like I said, I want this to be sort of a fundamental and foundational video, and of course in future videos I will go more in depth, and I tried to set it up so that it's as minimum effort as possible. So just the basic fundamental things you can do to see some pretty great results with your strings and get some great sounding strings right away. Now I will point out too, in this video we're just going to be focusing on string pads, or like long strings. So we're not going to be covering short strings, we're not going to be doing a bunch of moving lines and such. We're just doing like basic chord progression type stuff, long strings that are can be in the background of your songs, or just long string pads, that kind of thing. So this is sort of the the easiest way to write strings and the most basic. So we're just going to look at how you can get realistic string sounds with this technique. So let's look at our first example here that I have labeled bad strings. Now let's just say if you start with a chord progression, something like this, this is kind of where we're starting. Right, doesn't sound that great. So the first tip that we're going to cover is called voice leading. Now with voice leading, what that essentially is, to put it simply, is how you write or arrange your chords. And so our goal is to have a smooth voice leading. That's a very common term when you're learning orchestration and arranging. And so if we look at this first example again, you can see the chords are kind of jumping all over the place. That doesn't sound good, number one, and it doesn't sound realistic. Now if you're writing this chord progression, an easy way to think about it is, how can I move between these chords with as little to no movement as possible? So like for example, if you have an A in both chords, you can keep that A there instead of jumping around, or just keeping as little movement as possible. So with good voice leading, we can look at this region here, see how there's just a lot less movement and the chords are a lot closer together. Let's just listen to these back to back and you can hear the example. All right, and the second chord I did add an extra note just to sort of help the chord progression. And if you do recognize this chord progression, it's from one of my favorite pieces of all time called Nuvole Bianche by Ludovico Einaudi. It's actually the piece that made me want to learn piano. It's a really, really beautiful piece. And so even just with basic voice leading, even though we're still using not very good sounding samples and the strings don't sound that great, even just writing the chords in this way and using smooth voice leading, that already made the sound way, way better. Tip number 2 is going to be to use realistic sounding samples. So obviously, as you can tell, these stock Logic string sounds that I'm using aren't the best. They don't sound that great. A big thing you can do, obviously, to get realistic sounding strings is just to use realistic sounding strings. Buy some better orchestral string libraries. So without changing anything else, just copying this exact MIDI region and then using a better string library. We're still using an ensemble patch, nothing else has changed, but I am using the modern scoring strings now. Let's go ahead and listen to what this sounds like. All right, so you can hear how much better that sounds just using better samples. Like I said, the part didn't change. I didn't add or edit anything else, just simply using some great sounding string samples. Tip number 3 is going to be use modulation or automate the dynamics. Now, depending on the string library that you're using, this might look a little bit different, but with most string libraries, you can just automate the mod wheel and it's going to adjust the dynamics. Now, what this is going to do is basically automate or modulate through different velocity layers. So if you think about a string, or even let's think about a synth. So if you think about a synth, let's just say you have 5 different velocity layers going from like super soft to super hard. You might play those notes individually and you can hear the different velocity layers. But with strings, if you think about the natural way that they play, they might start bowing super soft and then by the end of the note be super, a much higher velocity. And so what we can do is actually automate through those. So it's not like stair stepping through the velocities, but it sounds much more natural. So if I open this library here, you can see just by adding modulation, you'll see this dynamics wheel there be adjusted. So again, that's just a minor tweak and already a huge improvement. If I open this up here, we look at the automation. You can see I just drew in some modulation here. Again, we'll just watch this so you can kind of see how that affects it. All right, huge improvement there. Tip number 4 is going to be to write out individual parts and not use ensemble patches. So this is more of a guideline and it depends, on your situation. I actually have used ensemble patches in quite a few songs, and actually I did a full breakdown of a big cinematic pop song that I did that actually landed a few Yamaha ads, and in that song I actually did use the ensemble patch. So if you want to check out that video, I'll link it down below and it should be above right now as well. But to get a more realistic string sound, typically you're going to be better off writing out individual parts. So instead of just having this big ensemble patch with the full string section, we're going to actually write out the violin 1, violin 2, viola, cello, bass parts all individually. Now what this is going to allow you to do is control each of those sections individually, and more often than not, it's just going to sound a lot more realistic. So again, I wanted to keep this video as simple as possible and as minimum effort as possible. So instead of actually writing out all these parts, I literally just took this MIDI region and then put the top note in violin 1 and then the next note in violin 2 all the way down. And obviously there's 5 parts here and some of the chords only had 4 notes, so I just use the same top note on violin 1 and violin 2. So if we highlight all these sections together and look at the piano roll, you can see it's the exact same chord progression. Now when you're writing for strings, typically you wouldn't necessarily do this. You might have violin 1 and violin 2 in octaves, and you might have the basses an octave lower. But again, I just want to keep this as simple as possible and just show you that even with minimal effort, you can get some great results. So just separating those parts, and again, it's just all copied, keeping it very simple. Let's go ahead and listen to what this sounds like. Okay, and even without changing those parts, I feel like you can still pick out the sections a little bit better, right? It's still an improvement in the sound. And again, if we're doing more advanced stuff and we're actually writing individual moving parts within the sections, or, wanting to control the volume of certain sections, doing it this way allows you to do that. You'll get much better results. Tip number 5 is going to be layer different sample libraries. Now, there's many different reasons for this. Maybe one sample library has a few imperfections, or maybe has a certain sound characteristic, and then you might blend another library that has a different sound characteristic. Like maybe one is a little bit more dry and has more top end, and the other's a bit more wet and warm, or whatever it might be. But typically, if you blend different libraries together, you're going to get much better results, because it's probably going to sound more natural, get a bigger sound, and yeah, it's just a great way to get more realistic sounding strings. So again, as little effort as possible, we just drag these MIDI regions here down to another string section, and for this, I'm using the Cinematic Studio strings. We have the exact same MIDI data, again, super low effort, same modulation data, everything's the same. We just have the modern scoring strings and the Cinematic Studio strings playing together now. Let's go ahead and listen to what this sounds like. All right, so you can hear what that sounds like. Again, another great tip and a great way to get great sounding strings. All right, tip number 6 is use reverb sends. So instead of using the reverb that comes with your string library, if you're mixing a bunch of different string libraries together, even orchestral libraries together, a great way to make them sound more realistic and cohesive is to, instead of using the reverb that's built in with that instrument, we're actually going to bus them all to the same reverb. Now, a very common approach with this is to actually use 2 reverbs. So the first reverb that we're going to send them to is a convolution reverb, which is simulating a scoring stage. So it sounds like they're all on the same stage together. And then we're also going to send them to a hall. So here we have the same example as before. I have all the same instruments loaded, except now I have turned off the internal reverbs and we're busing them all to the same reverbs. So if we look at the mixer window here, you can see that all of these are bused to what I have as bus 11 and bus 13. All these strings here, we'll just go back and look at one of these here. So bus 11 is this altiverb here, and we have the Todd AO scoring stage. And then they're also going to a long reverb, a hall, which I just have Valhalla vintage verb for this. All right, so let's go ahead and listen to what these sound like with the bus reverb. All right, so you can hear what that sounds like, just a beautiful, big, lush string sound. Tip number 7 is going to be use negative delay. So this is actually going to help you with writing your string parts and getting them to be in time. So if you've worked with orchestral sample libraries and MIDI strings or different MIDI orchestral instruments, you might have noticed that they're not playing in time, especially with the different articulations, and you might be wondering what's going on, and you find yourself dragging MIDI notes around just to get them to play in time, which obviously if they're all out of time, they're not going to sound realistic. So a really, really easy way to get your strings and other orchestral sample libraries to play in time is to use something called negative delay. Bit of a more complex topic, but essentially if we think about it simply, the way that orchestral instruments play, and we'll just think about strings here, is especially with like long notes, they're not like a synth. It's not just starting at full velocity. They sort of ease into the articulation, right? And depending on what the articulation is, it might take longer or shorter amounts of time to get to full velocity. That, as well as with the way that they're recorded and the way that the samples are edited. Again, it's kind of a more complex topic. And if you want, I'll link some videos down below if you want to learn more about negative track delay. But what you can do, instead of dragging MIDI notes around to get them to play in time, you can utilize, at least in Logic, if we look over here to the track window here and then see how I have this delay set to negative 440 milliseconds. Now, with modern scoring strings, they have this really great look ahead feature. So if I open this library here and scroll down to the performance page, if you turn on this look ahead feature, it actually tells you, see how this says 440 milliseconds? It tells you what to set the negative delay to, which is really, really great. That makes it easy to use. Now with other libraries, you might be able to find these numbers in the manual, like with Cinematic Studio Strings, it says in the user manual to set all short articulations to negative 60, or to use a 60 millisecond negative delay. Another really great way to find these negative track delay amounts is with this online database, the spreadsheet we're looking at right now. This was created by a composer named David Cadell. Hopefully I'm saying your name right, David, if you happen to see this. And he does have a video as well going over negative track delay and covering this database, I believe, so I will link that down below as well. Essentially though, you can look at this database and find negative track delays for many different sample libraries. Obviously, it's not going to have every sample library out there, but it does have a lot of really popular and common sample libraries. So for example, right at the top here, we can see Cinematic Studio Strings like we were talking about. And you can see the different negative track delays for different articulations. And you can search through this database and see if, the sample library that you're using is in here. And of course, if you look at the bottom, you can find different sections. So like if we're looking for brass, maybe we can look at brass. And of course, an easy way to search through this on a Mac would be Command F. And you can see I still have this saved from earlier. I was looking at fluid brass. So if we just hit enter, you can find fluid brass right here. And for the staccato, which I think it's just the one articulation in fluid brass, because it's just like the fluid shorts library. And again, all we're doing with negative delay is basically triggering the MIDI notes early. And so if you have your delay set to negative 100, that just means that those MIDI notes on that track are going to be triggered 100 milliseconds early. So if you time this right, then you can, write all of your parts on the grid and you don't have to worry about nudging MIDI notes around all the time. And it just saves you a whole lot of time and headache. Everything will be in time and you can just compose much faster and just, your workflow is just much, much better and much more optimized. For other libraries, you might just have to figure it out by ear. You kind of play around with it. All right, so that is another tip that will save you a ton of time, and it's just makes, getting your orchestral instruments to play in time with each other much, much easier. Now, a last bonus tip would be to just listen to a lot of real strings. And so if you're trying to achieve a realistic string sound, you should know what that sound is, so make sure you're listening to examples in the genre that you want to create. Listen to what real strings sound like and sort of just trying to recreate that sound. All right, so I hope this video is helpful. Again, this is kind of just a fundamental and foundational look at how to get realistic MIDI strings, just doing some basic things here, not going super in depth. In future videos, I definitely will go more in depth with string writing, and if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave those down below. If you do want to see how I use string libraries in action in some real productions, I actually did do a 2-part video series on how I make cinematic music for brands and ads, breaking down the productions and actually showing how I produce those songs. So in part 1, I go through some custom, sort of minimal emotional cinematic music that I did for a brand called Peter Millar. And then in part 2, I break down a big cinematic pop production that I did, and that landed a few Yamaha ads. So if you want to check those out, I'll leave the links down below. Again, hope this video is helpful. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.